How did I go from this to this? Well, it didn't happen overnight. So here's my story about how I went from a conservative-leaning 18-year-old who was really gung-ho about the military to an anti-war pacifist, blue-haired leftist. Hello everyone, it's Emma and welcome back to my channel where I talk about all sorts of things zero waste, focusing on free, easy, and fun ways to live low waste. If I talk a little bit too fast for you, your icon right down here where you can hear the speed of the video. And today, we're finally talking about my zero waste story. I've talked a little bit about it in the past, but this time we're talking about it from a little bit more of a political lens. And in particular, about how the military had such an important factor in my life in making me woke. Yes, you heard that right, the military made me woke. So let's go back in time to Ohio. So for some context, I grew up in Ohio, born and raised, where pretty much everybody looked and acted and thought exactly like I did. Almost everybody was white. I didn't know a single immigrant. I didn't know a single homeless person. I didn't even know of a single homeless person. There was very little pollution, physical or air pollution or water pollution. We did not see the impacts of climate change. Of course, growing up in the early 2000s, climate change was also highly stigmatized. And I grew up in a farming family, like a long line of farmers. We owned basically all the farmland in the county. But anyway, basically everybody that I interacted with at school, at social events, at sports, clubs, etc., basically just thought and acted the same way as I did. Or rather, maybe I thought and acted the same way that they did as my peers. It's not like teenagers really have original thoughts. Teenagers just kind of, absorb stuff that happens around them. And I basically just regurgitated anything that my friends said, that my parents said, that I heard on the news, that I saw shared on Facebook. And that's kind of what I thought politically. Now, it's very, very interesting to look back on it now, like at my Facebook memories. There are times I will say something that I shared as a teenager that I'm just like, that probably was not the most thoughtful thing to have said. But then like in the same memory, so like the same year, same timeline, I would share something about like recycling. So it's like, there was inklings of me being woke as a teenager because I really cared about recycling. I really cared about the planet. I believed in climate change when it was not cool to do so in rural Ohio. So it took me literally leaving Ohio, leaving this bubble, the wokeness in me to really blossom. And what it took for me to leave Ohio was joining the Air Force. And not just leaving Ohio, moving 7,000 miles away. But first, before we get to Japan, we have to stop by Texas. So first stop in the Air Force is basic training. Every single person in the Air Force goes to San Antonio, Texas, to Lackland Air Force Base. And truly, at basic training, I turned my brain off for 2 months. It was no think, only do. I loved it, honestly. I didn't have to think at all. They told me when to get dressed, what to wear, how to wear my hair. But this was also my first wake-up call into the real world. This was the first time that I really interacted with people of color. I also met immigrants for the first time, people who were immigrating to the United States using the military as a way to get citizenship. I met people of so many different walks of life, people who grew up very wealthy, people who grew up impoverished, some people who were using this as a means to get off the street. The military is truly a melting pot where you get to meet so many different people, and man, were my eyes opened. We didn't really have a whole lot of time for conversation and stuff and basic training, so it wasn't until I moved to tech school, another part of Texas in San Angelo, Texas. This is like oil country, Texas, West Texas, that I finally was able to turn my brain on and have conversations with people instead of just like go through the motions and get to graduation. So I was here for like another 8 months or so in a totally different region of Texas, which was very different. Here, my eyes were first opened to recycling. I've always been passionate about recycling. It was like my special interest in high school. And I was seeing how much waste was produced on base. It was so much, and none of it was recycled. And I knew that there was something to be done about it. So this was kind of my first taste of activism, I suppose, as well. I started a recycling program. I gathered bins. I think I might have even purchased trash bags. I made flyers, I printed them off, and every single Saturday, while everyone else is partying and drinking and having fun, I was collecting recycling. Collecting and sorting and transporting recycling. But honestly, it was so fun. It was my ideal week. This was also where I started to use a reusable water bottle and think more consciously about like the things that I packed for lunch and snacks. I also started to become more conscious of who I was following on social media. I was following people who were like inspiring me, not just like friends and family anymore. Following, some activists and content creators back in the day, like before content creators was a normal thing. It was mostly like when Instagram was like a blog. But I didn't really change much of my lifestyle until I moved to Japan. So the Air Force took Dan to Japan. Dan joined the military, we got married, I joined the military, and then we went to Japan. That's why we got married so young, was so that we could move together. The Air Force sent me to Japan to follow Dan, and wow, were my eyes open. Okinawa, Japan is a tiny island southwest of the mainland of Japan, directly east of Taiwan. An island of the Pacific Ocean means that a lot of waste will end up on the shores. I quickly learned that much of the recycling efforts were in vain. Reduction is the key, not recycling. So I did still focus heavily on recycling here, but instead I dove headfirst into swaps. I got a reusable coffee cup, grocery bags, I started making food from scratch, used dryer balls, you name it. I tried everything. Once I ran out of something wasteful. But this was also extremely eye-opening based on where I lived. At this time, I was binging Shell Bizzle and Get a Mary on YouTube, and other people like Emmy Lucas and Catherine Kellogg. They all shopped at the bulk store, they all walked, they all biked, spiked. Many of them were also homeowners, so they were able to modify their homes with rain barrels and solar panels and things of that nature. And I couldn't do any of that. I was a renter, I was living on a military base, and I was living in a foreign country and living on an island that really, they care about the environment there, but there was not really an infrastructure for things like commercial composting and bulk stores and things of that nature. So I started to question, like, could I be part of this zero waste movement? Could I join zero waste if I don't have access to any of this stuff? And I decided that the answer was yes. Like, I don't care if I can't compost. I don't care if I don't have solar panels. I don't care if I don't shop at the bulk store. I'm still gonna call myself zero waste, and I'm gonna find a way to be zero waste in my own life, because guess what? I'm not the only one who doesn't have access to a bulk store. I'm not the only one who doesn't have access to not compost. So that also inspired me to start social media, because I thought, we have all these amazing people doing such good stuff for the zero waste movement, but they all, they have access to bulk stores. They have access to all of this other stuff. What about the people who are like me? What about the people who don't have a bulk store? What about the people who have no choice but to drive a car because we don't live somewhere walkable? YouTube channel was born. YouTube was actually the first place that I started because YouTube was like in its prime in the late 2010s. So since day one, my mission has been to make zero waste living practical and easy. I wanted to make it accessible. Eco living for folks who don't want to spend a lot of time, energy, or money on the lifestyle. So I started making content online because I figured that there were other people like me out there. So thank you so much for being here. And that's not all from Okinawa. This was also where my activism started to kick off. Here I began reading eco-themed books and following new people online and speaking to people in my real life. Remember how I grew up? Yeah, this was the first time in my life that I had friends of color, queer friends, friends who grew up impoverished, friends who experienced homelessness, and so much more. I got to hear about their different walks of life and different worldviews, and that helped introduce me to intersectional environmentalism before I even knew what it was called. And living in another country really, really opened my eyes to how much literal propaganda that we are taught in the American education system. Stuff like World War II, the nuclear bombs, because that was the only way that we could possibly end World War II. That is untrue. Japan was already in talks about ending the war in the Pacific, in the war in Japan, before we dropped the bombs. And even when I was going to Japan, I was taught that we need these bases in Japan to defend ourselves from China. Similar to how Trump is using Greenland as a pawn right now. We need to be in Japan so that we can protect Japan from China, because we're the heroes, right? So as I started to unpack all of this and I started to learn the history of different cultures and different people involved in these, global events that the US was also a part of, something felt off, and rightfully so. So I kept learning. I went to Japanese museums. I talked to Japanese people as much as I could. And something else that I learned is the dark side of Okinawa. It is part of the Ryukyu Islands, the Ryukyuan people. They were their own independent country, nation, kingdom until Japan colonized them, just prior to World War II. So the whole chain of Okinawa, Ryukyu, was its own country. It is a very, very similar history to the history of Hawaii. And it was a terrible time for them, just prior to World War II, and especially when World War II started, because both Japan and the US saw the island of Okinawa as such a key target, right? The US wanted it so that they could get to Japan mainland, and Japan wanted it so they could not have the United States there. So Japan, initially, they said, no more Ryukyu language, no more Okinawan dialect, you have to speak Japanese. They enslaved people, they killed people in mass, and if you want to learn more about this topic, there's a really, really great book right here called Night in the American Village, where I learned a lot of this. So World War II comes along, US wins the war, and we save the Okinawan people, right? Nope. We also did not let them go back to speaking their native language. Instead, they had to learn English. They also had to drive on the US side of the road. They had to operate business with US money, and so forth. Sure, it wasn't quite as brutal as how they lived under Imperial Japan, but it was still not all sunshine and rainbows, and it was very unjust. How could it be when your culture and your homeland is totally gone and stolen from you yet again? This was really eye-opening to me. I was working on this base that I learned was stolen native land, as are basically all military bases. So at this point, I'm questioning everything. If you've ever watched Avatar: The Last Airbender, I was Zuko. I felt like Zuko when he realizes, oh, the Fire Nation's not so great after all. Everyone's, under the thumb of the Fire Nation. That was me. That was literally me living in Japan. It's the fact that the US doesn't acknowledge that, right? The US does not acknowledge that what they have done in the past is wrong and bad, and maybe we should make some reparations. No, instead they're just still trying to take more land, especially in Okinawa. Still actively happening. There's a coral reef right now. This was when I left. I left Japan 4 years ago. There was a coral reef, endangered species, on the north end of the island, again, like indigenous land, very untouched part of the island that the US said, we're gonna develop this and make it into an aircraft carrier base. Anyway, all that to say, it's really naive to sit here and claim that you're a patriot, you love the United States, you love this country, when you don't want to see your country progress and do better and acknowledge the harm that it has done. So at this point, these are all just kind of like vague ideas floating around in my head. This was late 2020, early 2021. So like pandemic, which was also extremely eye-opening, going through the pandemic in a foreign country. But it wasn't really until Las Vegas that I started to connect all of these dots, put all these pieces together, and become truly radicalized. So I moved back to the US after 3 years in Japan, and I experienced reverse culture shock. So culture shock is when you go to another country and you see this new culture, this new way of life, and it's shocking. Reverse culture shock is when you move back to your home country and it shocks you. It was so shocking, especially during COVID and also just this time in my life. My developmental adult years I spent living in a foreign country, and I didn't move back to the US until I was almost 23. So I was like entering my mid-20s when I moved back to my home country. Most people spend that time that I spent in Japan in college, just a short drive away from home. But I spent it 7,000 miles away from home, talking to people who don't speak the same language as me, at a different culture. So yeah, it was extremely eye-opening at that particular time in my life. And as I already said, spending a year and a half of the pandemic in Japan, a country that is very rule following, a country that cares a lot about community, a country that cares a lot about hygiene and cleanliness, was so shocking when I landed in the US. Again, this was like peak pandemic, right? This is early 2021. Not a single mask in sight. In Japan, masks, no question. Eating outside, no question. Travel bans, no question. Japan fared really, really well during the pandemic. But the first thing that I actually noticed upon landing in the United States was the abundance of American flags. They're everywhere. In Japan, it's really only government buildings, right? Like, you know, town hall, the mayor's place, whatever. Maybe schools, maybe banks, but like very few Japanese flags. And it's not to say that they're not proud of their country, but it's just weird to have your country's flag flying everywhere. Oh my gosh, and another big one was how unsafe I felt in the US. Oh gosh, especially moving to Vegas. Vegas is kind of sketchy town. In Japan, I never locked my car and rarely locked my house. I never felt the need to check over my shoulder. I never felt the need to carry pepper spray, a knife, or anything like that. We even slept with our windows open. So moving to Vegas, especially of all places, was so alarming. It was like maybe 2 months after we moved to Vegas, we had an attempted break-in. Our mailbox was broken into several times while we lived there. So all of this combined, I just started to ask myself some questions. Why was crime so high? Why did I feel safer in a country that I was legally not allowed to carry a gun, let alone a knife or pepper spray in? Why is the Japanese community, why is Japanese society so heavily focused on community and safety? Another observation is children in Japan, you would not believe how much freedom these children have. I'm talking children as young as like 3 years old, walking themselves to school because that's how safe it is. I don't even feel safe as an adult walking around by myself. And also, why is Japan so clean if there's no public trash cans? Vegas is so dirty. It was so dirty. Anyway, the dots were connecting, the intersectional environmentalism was building. I kept reading books, I kept making connections online, and I kept learning from diverse activists across the board, not just environmentalists. I started to learn how race was connected to climate change and how poverty and homelessness and gender and so on and so on and so forth was all connected. Plus, every single time that I moved to the military, my eyes were open to a new environmental issue. So in Japan, it was the waste, waste in our oceans and how recycling is not a solution. In Vegas, it was water. We were in an extreme drought in Vegas. They're still in an extreme drought. And I've always loved the outdoors. I grew up hiking. We grew up going camping every now and then. Even just being outside, being part of growing a garden growing up. Very involved in being outdoors. But once again, it wasn't until I moved to Las Vegas that I really started to learn about public lands as a whole, how it's more than just the National Park Service, and about how such a big role our public lands play in climate change, which you can learn more about in this video, and how they're constantly under threat, but particularly under this administration. Just before I moved to the desert, Trump in his first term shrunk 2 huge national monuments in Utah, Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante. Biden restored them and also created Avi Kwame National Monument, a huge deal to the indigenous peoples and the broader fight for climate change. So I began to learn more about ecosystems and birds and trees and got my passion for plants while living and hiking there. And Las Vegas was my last home while I was active duty. I did live in Washington while I was technically still in the military for the Skillbridge internship program. I have lived in Washington, Ohio again, Minnesota, and now Northern California. And all of these moves have taught me something different about public lands, about forest fires, about drought, about climate education, about intersectionality, and so much more. So those are kind of my major lessons that I learned about, about politics, but also about climate change, about environmentalism and intersectionality. But I did have a few other epiphanies along the way, especially now as a veteran. So while I was active duty, I had free healthcare. And as a veteran, I still receive free healthcare from the government. Shout out to the government for the free healthcare. If I can have free healthcare, why can't every other American not have free healthcare? Oh, 'cause you earned it. No, I didn't. Okay? If you're gonna give people healthcare based off of merit, I did not earn it. Yes, some veterans did earn it, if you're gonna put it in those terms, because they were deployed. They were in the line of fire. They truly risked their lives and their limbs and their livelihoods and their mental health. That's not to say my time in the military didn't freaking suck. because it did, but I was safe. I was safe 100% of the time. So I went through training, and then like my first 6 months or so at my base, I didn't have the proper clearance that I needed to do my job. So I didn't do anything for 6 months. Moving to Vegas, I did do my job for real in Vegas for like a year, and then I became the commander's executive assistant. I was basically a secretary. All I did was answer about 3 phone calls a day, send about 5 emails, and once again, watched YouTube for most of the day. If you're gonna put it in terms of you have to earn your free healthcare, I did not, okay? If me, who watched YouTube for most of my time in the military, not most of my time, you get it, I actually did my job. Why don't our teachers get free healthcare? I think our teachers served this country more than I did. Why don't our park rangers get free healthcare? They're serving this country. They're serving it on the home front. You know, why do our EMTs, why do our firefighters not get free healthcare? They're literally saving lives. I already have a bachelor's degree that I got using my tuition assistance while I was active duty, and I'm currently using my GI Bill. GI Bill 1 out of 2. You get 2 GI Bills now if you play your cards right. So I'm going to get several free degrees, again, that I earned. In the military too, you get a universal basic income. This is why the military, precisely the military, made me woke. Because the military is low-key socialist. Anyway, basically everybody who's an E5, we'll just say E5 because that's what my rank was when I got out. All E5s get paid the exact same money, regardless on if you work on classified systems, regardless on if you're fixing million-dollar aircraft, or regardless of if you're cleaning off gym equipment, because that's your job. No matter how difficult, how easy, no matter if you're saving lives, no matter if you're just signing people's paychecks, you all get paid the same amount of money for the same amount of rank. You also get a uniform allowance. You also get a housing allowance. You also get a food allowance. You also get an increase in pay if you have dependents, to include spouses and children. A taste of socialism. It's not true, pure socialism. I know that. In fact, it's closer to communism. If the military functions so well, with universal basic income, with free healthcare, with free education, why can't the rest of the US? So I started to raise some eyebrows. I started to raise some questions for me. And then also start to question the military budget. Why is our military budget, now in 2025, nearly $1 trillion? That's 999 plus $1 billion. So we don't need to raise taxes in order to provide healthcare for all. We just need to reallocate our billions of dollars in taxes every year. A good chunk of that goes to the military. Sure, national security is important. I'm not going to negate that. But you'd be surprised at how much money in the military is wasted due to use or lose funds. Basically meaning at the end of the fiscal year, if your unit has $10,000 and you don't spend it all in September before the fiscal year starts in October rolls around, your money's gone. Not only is that $10,000 gone from the last fiscal year, but the next fiscal year, you're not getting any of that money because you didn't use it last year, you're not going to need it this year, right? So it forces these units to use that money that they do not need to use in wasteful and frivolous ways. And that's just one example, which I talk more about in this video. This was all just kind of part of the propaganda that I had to unlearn myself. Because again, yes, our military members do sacrifice a lot. Even though I was totally safe the entire time, I did sacrifice my early 20s. I sacrificed my mental health. I hated my job, especially while I was in Japan. But that's not to say, you know, our EMTs, our firefighters, our teachers don't also sacrifice their mental and physical health. That somehow I get to live a comfortable life with free healthcare and free education handed to me because I just did a quick 6-year stint in the military. So really this all has been very new revelations to me. I got out a year and a half ago, honestly. It's been a long time. Time is flying. So I got out about a year and a half ago, and ever since then I've been evaluating all of this stuff. I was 24 when I got out of the military. Those 6 years changed me for the better. That's not to say I didn't hate it. Again, I did. I don't regret joining, and I am forever grateful to be done. But it is simply not a place for anti-war leftists. It was emotionally taxing going to a job that I disagreed with so hard. But I learned so much that kept me wanting to learn. I am now involved with Veterans for Peace and continue to learn about politics and share what I learn here too. It truly is amazing how a little bit of empathy, open-mindedness, and willingness to learn from other people with different walks of lives can change a person. It is amazing how when you evaluate that what you were taught as a child was, quite frankly, propaganda, and when you start to learn that, oh, there's another side to World War II. Oh, there's another side to this. Again, maybe not even necessarily saying like one side's right, one side's wrong, but just saying, oh, both of these stories are valid. Let me draw my own conclusions, actually, instead of just being fed this one narrative for my entire life. So a few things that I have learned, and I guess the conclusions that we can draw from this video. We need more empathy in the world. No one single person lives precisely the way that you do. Recognize that everybody is different, everybody has different needs, and that is beautiful. And this was a big topic of discussion. I think this was 2022 when Biden was forgiving student loans. And so many people that I know from back in Ohio were like, this is unfair, blah, 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 blah. I shouldn't have to use my tax money to pay for people's education. And so I chimed in, I said, your tax money paid for my degree. And everyone's like, oh, but you earned it. You know, that conversation. And same with the free healthcare. Like, I don't want my tax dollars to go to pay for someone else's surgery or whatever. I think that comes from a place of jealousy. I truly do. And I get it. You know, these people who are older, who don't want, you know, young people these days to have free education, they did have to work hard for their education. I won't dismiss that. They did have to work hard to buy a house. But also back in the day, the amount of hours that you had to work at a minimum wage paying job to buy a house was not nearly as much as you have to work now. Again, I think people back in the day worked hard, and I think people today work equally hard, but stuff is way more expensive these days. And also, why would you not want a better future for your children, for your grandchildren, for your generations to come? That is how we have a better future, is by allowing for more opportunities for people. Also, be kind. Remember where you started. You know, if you're someone who's similar to me and you also grew up maybe conservative and now you're left leaning, please remember that when you're engaging with people. Don't just hate people because of their opinions. Don't just hate people because of this and that. Have a conversation. Listen to what they have to say. Don't talk at somebody. Don't talk down to somebody. Don't talk at them because you want to change their mind. Have a conversation. That goes both ways, of course. If they're not willing to also listen to you, then it might be a little bit pointless. And also what it comes down to is we are truly so much more similar than we think. I'm not the problem. You're not the problem when it comes to the economy, when it comes to climate change, any of that. None of us are the problem. We gotta look in the right direction. At the end of the day, it is still very crazy to me that empathy is radical. In fact, I believe it was called a sin recently by a pastor, the sin of empathy, which is just mind-blowing to me. It's also crazy to me that my desire to have a clean planet, clean water, clean air, clean future is radical, is political. I feel like that's something that we should all want. We should all strive to have a clean home. There you have it. This was kind of the short version, despite my yapping and yapping. If you want to read the full version on the blog, it's down below. It's got a little bit more detail in there, but I'm done yapping for today. I appreciate you listening. And again, I'm still learning. I've been on a big nonfiction kick in the last like 3 to 4 months. Leave your nonfiction recs down below. My favorite nonfiction book of the year and potentially of all time is Just Mercy. Oh my gosh. Talk about unlearning, about our prison system, about racism, about homelessness. I have more book recs, political, environmental, anything in between on my website that you can check out down below. Keep reading, keep learning, keep having empathy. Please care about one another. Yeah, anyway, that's my story. Feel free to share yours down below. How did you become, you know, a radical environmentalist? How did you become someone who cares about the planet and who cares about others? What radicalized you? For me, it was the military, which is very, very crazy to say. It's also been very interesting. I've had some conversations with people on TikTok about how the military actually made them like more conservative. And it's so interesting how the military will do that. It will push you on either extreme and you pretty much land on either camp, nowhere in the middle. Very, very interesting. So there you have it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. I appreciate your time. I'll see you in the next video. But until then, remember that your small actions make a big difference in the long run. Bye guys. Backtrack. It's only 10 a.m. Anyway, all that to say, it's naive to sit naive.